everyone. We're going to get started. Come on in, find a seat. There's tons of room up front. I was a riot girl in the 90s, and we used to always say girls up front, so I'm going to make that call. So there's plenty of room. Thanks, everyone, for being here this morning. I wanted to get a prompt start because, number one, I'm all about accountability and efficiency, but also because we have such a jam-packed day again today. I wanted to welcome you all here to the great city of Baltimore. Thanks so much for being here and joining us both yesterday and today. I thought yesterday was such a wonderful, content-filled experience, and really want to thank my colleague, Ben Siegel, for putting together such an incredible event. We're so lucky to have him on our team, and we're very excited to be working with him at 21cc. My name is Beth Blauer. I am the Executive Director of the Center for Government Excellence. We call ourselves GovEx because the Center for Government Excellence is a complete mouthful. And we are a completely brand new center. We're about a year old in the Krieger School at Johns Hopkins University. We came about campus a little bit in a little bit of a non-traditional way, but it has been a magical pairing. And so we are very fortunate to work within the 21st Century Cities Initiative with Ben and Dr. Eden. And it's been one of the most rewarding professional experiences. I was brought into the process through a relationship with the Bloomberg Philanthropies, and when they said that they wanted to build a center that was designed to help the 21st century city experience using data and evidence, and they wanted to do it at Johns Hopkins University, the school that was in my backyard, I couldn't have been more pleased. And it's been an absolutely incredible experience, and a lot of it due in large part to the faculty and the support that we've received from campus. So I just want to thank Dr. Eden, especially for her support and help as we've grown our center over the last year. We would not have been as successful in our work without her help and guidance. A little bit of background about what we're doing at GovEx. Over the next year and a half, we're going to complete a round where we'll visit over 100 mid-sized cities across the United States, where we're collecting a national baseline of information and data around how cities are doing using data and evidence in their regular work. The idea is for us to get a good idea of what's working and what's not working in mid-sized cities, and then to help invest in practices that will advance their ability to use data and evidence in a rigorous, meaningful way to drive towards outcomes that will improve the city experience, that will keep people thriving and cities growing in good and healthy, positive ways. Whoa. Sorry about that. I'll step away from the microphone. And today is a moment in this journey that we've been waiting for a long time. One of the most exciting things about being paired with university and with Dr. Eden is this opportunity to start really thinking critically about how we can pair cutting-edge, forward-thinking, world-class research with the work that mayors are doing in their cities in a way that is driving change. And this moment that we're celebrating today is really a launching point for that, is really the first step that we've taken as an initiative to pair this type of research and this type of critical thinking with the work that we're doing when we're going in and implementing in cities. And so I challenge everyone this morning to think really about how it is that whether you're a local government leader or whether you're working on the research side, how can you work with your anchor institutions in your cities? How can you work with academic researchers in a way that will drive change in your cities, that will have meaningful impacts on the people that are living in your communities, and that will really help us think about what does it look like to really do meaningful research paired with world-class leadership in our mid-sized cities, where we think certainly, and we've placed a large investment and bet on the fact that our mid-sized cities are going to be the anchors of this country moving forward into the next century. So we are excited, we are happy, and we are very thankful for all of the help. The conference, again, would not have been able to pull it off yesterday, and certainly not today, without the help of Ben and Ava and AJ. So thank you so much for helping us. And I would be really remiss if I didn't thank my own team. I really did nothing to prepare for this event. It was really all on the shoulders of Catherine Klosik and Sharon Paley, so I'd love to thank them. They are they are my team, my right and left hands, and they are here to help you and shepherd us through this wonderful day. I'm also very, very excited to be joined by some of our city leaders that are participating in What Works Cities and that have been leading our work in their own cities. So Mayor Sawicki from Cape Coral, Florida, thank you for being here. Mayor Yarber from Jackson, our trusted partner in a lot of great work that's happening in Jackson. Mayor Watts from Denton, Texas. County Administrator Melissa Munt from Wyandotte County, Kansas, which is Kansas City, Kansas. Thank you for being here. The Vice Mayor Levanta Williams of Wichita. Police Chief Buckner of Little Rock, thank you today for being here and for your comments yesterday. I thought were really incredible. Council Member Woodwards of Tacoma, and Senior Policy Advisor and Director of Strategic Partnerships and Innovation, and my good friend Con Russo from San Jose. Thank you all for being here, for being part of this important dialogue, this important exchange. And I really do want everyone to think about the opportunity that we have to pair cutting-edge research, data and evidence with the challenges that you're facing every day as you try to deliver better services, as you try to make a more connected city for your residents. And I couldn't think of a better keynote speaker than our good friend, Dr. Nathan Connolly. As we work in our own cities, we are faced every day with the crippling challenges of race and poverty and the impacts that they have on cities and mayors' ability to lead, cities' ability to grow in smart and positive ways, and really some of the most fundamental challenges to the next phase of the city evolution is really going to be how we handle these tough issues. We are so fortunate to have Dr. Connolly with us. That he is the Herbert Baxter Adams Associate Professor of History, and he writes and talks deeply about the interplay between racism, capitalism, politics, and the built environment in the 20th century. He'll deliver our keynote address, and it is a backdrop for a conversation that I hope drives a lot of the other conversations that we'll have in the many rooms that we'll be in today. I couldn't think of a more perfect person to join us. I'm so pleased that he's agreed to do it, and I would love everyone to join me as we warmly welcome Dr. Connolly to our dais.
I want to thank Beth and Kathy Eden and Kathy Klosik and Ben Siegel and so many other folks who are looking for some real estate here. Always looking for real estate, that's the thing. For pulling this all together. You know, I am a family man. I have 3 young children. And my youngest boy, Elijah, insisted this morning before I left the house that I take my fortune cookie with me from last night's dinner. And I threw it in my pocket, and I ran out the door, and I grabbed my bag and my items, and I reached to look for my cell phone and realized that I had my fortune cookie still in my pocket before today's event. And so I thought, well, there's no better time to find out how today is going to go than to open my fortune cookie and see what it says. So I open it, and it's empty. I'm alone up here right now. I love my family, and one of the things that came to mind in preparation for today were conversations that I would have with my grandmother when she was still alive. She passed away several years ago. And my grandmother was a very, very careful woman. She was born in Jamaica. And she had dear friends who used to come by the house. She was a nurse, and one of them was a woman who brought fish to the house, and she had to go take the fish outside and carefully clean the fish by the canal. So we would do this together, my grandmother and I. We would scale them, and we would gut them, and we would talk about various things. And during one of these conversations down by the waterside, she would tell me about the lessons that she wanted to tell her own children. My grandmother had 4 daughters that were born at various points during her travels. And she told me, without any bat of an eye, a lesson that she imparted to her children. And she used to say, if you want to make it in America, you need to marry someone who's either rich, white, or educated. And I just kind of gave her a look. She's like, that's basically how you make it in this country. And I've always remembered that, and I actually have taken that now to a number of different places, including archives, as I'm researching the history of my grandmother's life, my grandfather's life, as they migrated from the Caribbean to Britain in the 40s and 50s, to New England, and eventually down to the Sun Belt South. And this idea about safety and security is part of what I wanted to talk about today. See, the lesson that one needs to marry rich, white, or educated might strike us as a bit strange, but it made perfect sense to a very careful woman. See, those are the things that kept one from being taken advantage of in certain contexts. If you had a certain amount of education, if you had a certain amount of wealth, if you had a certain amount of racial privilege, you could be safe from different kinds of predatory practices. I wrote about predation a little bit in my first book, A World More Concrete, and there I'm dealing a lot with the history of landlording, and I'm dealing with urban renewal and eminent domain, and so I'll give you a little bit of that for some of you who don't know me. Now, my life's work is really about this intersection of hope and predation, and the worlds that this intersection essentially creates. Now, there's a lot that we know already about segregation and inequality, and I want to share with you a little bit. I'm just going to see if I can get this to do what it does, all right? So far, so good. Fortune cookie is safe. This is a website that some collaborators and I have worked on. Now, this is interesting because I have to navigate it from here. Okay. Oh, there it goes. Hang on a second. All right, I'm going to have to. Okay, so this is a website called Mapping Inequality, and I actually have to look for now Baltimore on the map. What we've basically done is find, there she is, all of the redlining maps for the country, over 250 maps, digitize them and actually superimpose them onto the nation as a whole. So we can look at our fabled Baltimore here just for a moment. This is a way to kind of lay out the story that we know. This is a map that some of you are obviously going to be very familiar with. Now, what we've been able to do is show you the city as it was in 1938, and then scale back and show you the city as it exists today. I'm zooming in on this area here that's relatively well known. West Baltimore. And what I'm including in the area that I'm hearing Sandtown come from the audience is the area description. This is the actual federal document. Each one of the zones for each one of the districts has the actual federal page that tells you exactly what was there. Again, a lot of this is simply known information. Negro, yes, 35%. If you had one black person on a block, you got a D rating. Now, we know that these D areas were ones that eventually helped to determine who got help for loans by the Federal Housing Administration and so forth. But what we don't know about these D neighborhoods is the world behind the rating. See, when you don't have the availability of credit, you then create the conditions for predation. So areas like West Baltimore circa 1938 was a neighborhood in which the residents were only 20% homeowners, marked there, letter C. 80% were renting their homes. And it's the landlording problem that basically frames so much of what then becomes urban inequality in the 20th century. And I'm going to leave this up for just a moment. Well, during the course of my talk, you can look at it. I'm only going to use it for the introduction here. But I just wanted to, one, share with you this site as a plug because we're about to go public, and I want you all to know about it. And I can definitely talk more about it during the Q&A. But I also wanted to have us think about how often these kinds of notions of segregation and inequality are operating behind the scenes. And in most instances, we use very familiar explanations, such as culture, to explain the problems of segregation. There are people who don't want to move to certain areas, or they're unable and unskilled, and we have to find a way to basically improve their culture. Those of us who have some sense of structure, particularly after the 1970s, say, well, these are areas that lack investment. We need to have broad forms of economic growth in order to lift all boats, and that will then solve the problems of lingering poverty. Now, there was, in fact, a different way of thinking about this relative to the question of structure, and that was indeed a focus on the problem of predation in these communities. And the issue of framing is really critical because we're at a moment now where people don't tend to frame these issues very often around predation. We talked a little bit about predatory lending, but all the other various kinds of predatory practices that are going on in these communities often goes unremarked. Now, I want to share with you a moment in terms of how folks thought about this at an earlier period. In 1963, for the March on Washington, which we tend to think about as this great moment of a really great speech given by Martin Luther King, the manifesto of the folks who organized for jobs and freedom included a line very important line. It said, quote, integration in the fields of transportation, housing, education, and public accommodations will be of limited extent and duration, so long as fundamental economic inequality along racial lines persists, unquote. Feeding into that march was an understanding of the fact that black communities that were segregated were being taken advantage of in terms of their rent, in terms of their food quality, in terms of the ways in which students who were in segregated schools were actually released early to go work in fields in various parts of the country. It was a very immediate notion of predation. Martin Luther King in 1966, after the passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, said that last bit of work was easy compared to what's ahead, dealing with the problems of slums and jobs and employment. There was actually a way in which many Americans talked about their situation as a colonial situation. This may sound familiar to some folks who have a little gray in their beard, like me, right? Colonialism was an apt metaphor for describing what was going on in many of these communities in terms of the extraction that was occurring, in terms of the use of people from the black elite to govern as a kind of chieftain class, in a form of everyday indirect rule. Now, what we also need to think about is the money that's generated through these kinds of approaches. And I'm just going to briefly give you some introduction to this because, again, this is a world that we kind of thought we knew. The world of the D area descriptions is one in which landlords could expect to receive returns on their investment for slum property in the realm of 33 to 66% per year. Let me put that in perspective. If you were to make an investment, at minimum in 3 years' time, your investment would be paid in full, and the rest would be all profit, sometimes sooner. In the 1970s, after a number of reforms, including the passage of the Fair Housing Act, the margins in black communities were still fetching between 10 and 15% return on investment. In your average mainstream American community, profit margins are between 4 and 6% every year. Okay? Now, one of the things that's important to know about this particular problem is that landlords are finding ways to lobby and improve their position. And the same industry that is doing the redlining in the 1930s is trying to find ways to fold slum housing into their regulatory purview in the 1960s. The regulatory piece is really critical here because what we tend to do when we think about segregation is think about it as a hearts and minds problem rather than a regulation problem. I want to share with you this image, this artifact, really, from a bygone era. And I bring it in part to illustrate the point that we are not as far as we might seem from the era of colored waiting rooms, but more that these kinds of artifacts are actually pieces of regulation. They're pieces of negotiation. You had to, as a company, by Louisiana state law, create a colored waiting room. You had no choice in the matter. You had to create a colored-only car based on the regulations of the state of Louisiana, of Mississippi, of Alabama. Many people don't know that the very famous case, Plessy versus Ferguson, was actually fought not just by everyday citizens who wanted their rights, but by the railroad company itself that was trying to deregulate what was costing them twice as much than it should have. 2 railroad cars, 2 waiting rooms, 2 bathrooms. The point here is that there was actual collaboration between activists and capital to try to deregulate the problem of segregation. And this is important because segregation is still to this day a question of regulation. And I invite you to consider for a moment if there are points at which capital and activists are building alliances to deal with the problems of segregation, to actually write and rewrite the regulations. Just for a moment. Moving quickly, the story of 20th century America, again, behind the lines and the colors, is one in which you had many African Americans trying to move to the suburbs, being denied loans, which we know, but then they were being given other forms of credit, which is much more dangerous, right? Some of you are familiar with contract selling, which is where you basically have a rent-to-own situation. There are other folks who simply stayed in their homes and could charge their tenants an exorbitant amount of rent, even as they were living in single-family homes. There's a way in which you need to understand also that there are layers in which those who even own their own homes were being preyed upon through tax assessments and appraisals. right? So a house could be appraised at a lower value if you're an African American, but then assessed at a higher value than its white counterparts. Let me just say that for one other moment for those who might get lost in the policy piece. Your house could be appraised in terms of its value at a lower amount, which means you had a harder time accumulating equity and doing things with the credit you might be able to draw from your house, and yet it was assessed at a higher value than your white counterpart. So you're paying higher property taxes, trying to help city governments make up their shortfall. That was one way in which the experience of being African American in American cities essentially worked during this era of redlining. 98% of all the conventional mortgages, as you may know, under this program, were being given to whites, right? So that means that the rest is all having to find a way to deal with this kind of bottom-feeding economy. And there are activists across the country, again, in the moment this is going on, who are talking about this, who are dealing with this, who are using the language of predation and insurgency to try to make sure that these kinds of inequalities do not persist. By the way, the landlords, as it relates to the FHA, they eventually won because they were concerned about slum clearance and urban renewal. By 1949, 99% of all the rental housing being built in the post-war period was actually being subsidized by the FHA as well. So it's not just single-family homes and redlining on the one hand, it's landlords who are getting underwriting on the other hand from the federal government. One Baltimore tax assessor writing in 1973, discriminatory assessments are done by design to overcome weak revenue. Landlords themselves are not paying taxes or oftentimes becoming absentee. If you actually went underneath your 10 to 15% return, many people just leave their properties vacant and abandon them completely, right? And that would leave the city, in most cases, holding the bag. Now, I want to just pivot for a moment because you have two different contradictions. You have a pre-Fair Housing Act contradiction and a post-Fair Housing Act contradiction. Now, the pre-68 contradiction is, of course, that all Americans are being encouraged to buy. You're being encouraged to have a home, to send your kids to a great school, and yet you're being forced to rent through discriminatory practices. The post-68 contradiction, after the advent of the Fair Housing Act, which it should be remembered was passed in the wake of urban unrest following the assassination of Martin Luther King in April of 1968, the post-68 contradiction is that we need to give these areas access to more credit, but we're not actually going to regulate the predation. We're not going to look at the folks who are making their money with large margins and in exploitative fashion from these communities. So the federal government creates new programs. Again, some of you may be familiar with them. And they do a number of different things. Some of them are offering ways of subsidizing the higher interest rates that banks feel like they have to acquire or use. Some are asking for supplements for the rent. The Department of Housing and Urban Development spent over 40% of its budget in 1973 simply paying the interest to lenders who wanted to deal with the more dangerous economy of the ghetto, so to speak. 40%, $1.8 billion is paid directly to banks, simply so that they would then free up capital to go into these neighborhoods, right? There was another $66 billion paid in rent supplements to landlords over a 10-year period, again, from the federal government. See, desegregation became good business if the federal government was going to get involved. There were instruments that were specifically targeting declining areas, but one of the things to keep in mind, and this is another lesser-known story about white flight in urban America, is that in many instances, it wasn't simply that whites fled. Many of them held on to their homes in these communities. Capital, state, landlords began to invest. There are ways in which the FHA guidelines that privileged many of these inner-ring white communities during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s made it very difficult to then sell those houses in the 1960s and 70s. So they became rental properties. And believe it or not, the percentage of white ownership in black neighborhoods in the Jim Crow era, in some neighborhoods, which was 70%, my hometown, Miami, by the 1970s, that percentage of white ownership had actually increased after desegregation to 90%. 90% absentee ownership in the 1970s. And we wonder why there was rioting in Miami in the 1980s, right? There's a process that's important to keep in mind here, and this is one of the things that I really hope we can take from this gathering, is to really think about credible, nimble uses of the state. There's a whole story, of course, about the dangers of federal government bloat during the 1960s. We have to step away from that and, again, deregulate, deregulate, deregulate. There were some 12,000 houses in Los Angeles, for instance, that were just off the books. No one knew where they were, underwritten by federal money. They were all being used for rental properties of one kind or another, oftentimes illegally, right? There, of course, were ways of also taking advantage of foreclosure. So you can sell properties and sell deeds while they're in the process of foreclosure, which takes an extraordinarily long time. And before you knew it, a single-family house had become one in a community of slum properties that nobody knew what happened to. The backlog in HUD in the 1970s was such that it took 5 months to even get complaints heard by federal regulators, right? So Nixon's attempt to try to solve corruption in the FHA meant shutting down the program, the regulatory arm shut down, and you had a backlog. And so there was more and more difficulty. Now, in the meantime, of course, the landlord lobbyists of the 1940s had multiplied to a tremendous degree, and across the country, lobbyists in their numbers exploded. Between 1971 and 1982, the number of businesses with registered lobbyists in DC went up by a factor of 14. 14 in roughly a decade. There were about 175 lobbyists in the early 70s. There were 2,500 by the time you get to the 1980s. Of course, these are for a variety of industries: the gun industry, the grocery industry, real estate industry, and so forth, all finding ways to make the regulation maintain their margins. Political action committees exploded as well, 89 in the early 70s, up to 1,200 just 6 years later. I want to offer just a quick example of what the consequence of this can be. There's a phenomenal student who just graduated from the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University, Karina Christensen. She just published, or just finished a dissertation in the health policy program at Bloomberg. And what she discovered about grocery stores and food deserts I thought was worth sharing with the group. Some of you here, I'm sure, are familiar with the term, food deserts. Dr. Christensen discovered that food deserts became a relatively recent phenomenon in the discourse of food policy. It became the dominant way of talking about food insecurity in poor neighborhood and communities of color. But good food did not simply dry up in black and brown communities. The desert simply didn't emerge because historically there had never actually been good food provisions in black communities. And you can go back a very long way. Depending on how far back you want to go, to the slave cabin and so on and so forth, there's always been some disparity between blacks and whites on terms of the health question with food. But the importance here is that by calling something a food desert, which is ostensibly a kind of natural and environmental phenomenon, you can then use it as a way to create a tax structure that incentivizes the investment that needs to go back into these communities, rather than talking about the predation that's already happening in these spaces. I was at an event a couple years ago where a former governor of the state of Maryland, who shall go unnamed, and I were having a conversation about food services in West Baltimore, again, the same community. And there was a map that simply showed 3 really wonderful big grocery stores in North Baltimore, Roland Park, and many of you may know Eddie's and Whole Foods. And then the side on West Baltimore was all these small yellow dots that basically were corner stores and liquor stores. And so I asked the governor, I said, why is it that there's a market clearly in West Baltimore for some kind of food provision, and yet they can't get decent food? And his answer to me was simply liquor stores. The customers there like frequenting the liquor stores. It was a cultural explanation for the problem of food insecurity. Some of you were in the room during that conversation as well. The point is that giving people the options of all those yellow dots is not enough. That's not an actual option. The options need to reflect the interests of the folks in those communities. So part of what we can do in terms of partnering, again, capital and activists, is empowering people and providing political education for people so that their choices can actually reflect their interests. In other words, it's in our interests to allow other folks in the city to be able to protect their interests, articulate them, get audience with those who are in power, and so forth. Otherwise, the problems of predation shall continue. Again, this is really critical here. Businesses do not want to simply deregulate. They want to control regulation in ways that give them advantages over their competitors. If we're honest about that, maybe we can think a little bit more about how we can also work regulation and lobbying that helps to provide education for people, not just in terms of schools, but again, actual, and that's obviously critically important, but other kinds of political education avenues for the professionalization of activist communities. I'm wrapping up here in terms of one big piece of this whole puzzle, and that is the law. I wanted you to think about Plessy versus Ferguson partly as a moment of collusion, of organizing between activists and business. But also remember that Plessy versus Ferguson went into the history books as one of the most important pieces of jurisprudence that determined the next 60, 70 years of history in terms of the exploitation of communities, in terms of the violence. 1896. There's another decision that's far less known. It's Washington v. Davis, 1976. Now, Washington v. Davis, which was a case revolving around police training in Washington, D.C., is the case in which the court determined that the legal standard of discriminatory intent would basically be our era's Plessy versus Ferguson. What it means, in effect, is that you have to be able to prove that someone intentionally discriminated against you on the basis of race. And sometimes they have to furnish documents showing someone using off-color racial language, very inappropriate terms, and so on and so forth. You may remember, those of you who read the Ferguson report, they were looking for uses of racial language in the emails of Ferguson police, just so that they could then say that there was explicit racial bias in the policing of that community. Other instances around, say for instance, the killing of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman, or Donald Sterling's real estate practices in Los Angeles. All of this revolved around whether or not you could actually prove someone meant to discriminate. So in terms of resources and things that we can think about tackling as a collective, one of them needs to be the legal standard of discriminatory intent. And I'll give you one concrete example as to why. In the city of Baltimore in 2010, the bank Wells Fargo, I don't know if there are any Wells Fargo representatives in the room, it came up with a series of wealth creation seminars run through black churches, targeting communities that needed access to credit. Now, what they did was provided $250 kickbacks for every person they could get registered for a subprime mortgage. That kickback went to the pastor. Al Sharpton, Tavis Smiley, a number of black luminaries went into these churches and told people about the value of ownership. Now, again, this is Jim Crow's contradiction coming back. You're told to own, and yet you are being preyed upon in the process. Now, what's important to remember about these adjustable rate mortgages, and this is critical for just revising how we thought about this period, these are not people who are looking for homes that they can floss in and simply buy more than they can afford. These are people who are actually trying to refinance so they have more disposable income month to month because of the way the wealth gap has grown over the last 40 years, right? So refinance is what drove the subprime crisis, not people buying too much house. And in this particular church, in West Baltimore and a number of others, folks were signing up in droves for subprime mortgages with Wells Fargo, to the extent that many of them were over-leveraged, and of course, there were subsequent foreclosures and losses of the city's tax revenue. Nearly $14 million in taxes were lost by the city of Baltimore. Now, the NAACP wants to get involved and do its due diligence as a great preeminent civil rights organization. They want to talk about the targeting of these communities and reverse redlining, but they can't win the first case on behalf of the homeowners themselves because they can't prove that Wells Fargo meant to discriminate on the basis of race in these communities. Washington v. Davis. They then pivot to represent the city of Baltimore, trying to reclaim its $14 million in lost tax revenue from Wells Fargo. Again, they lose because they can't prove in court that Wells Fargo meant to undercut the city's tax base. Washington v. Davis. At this point, Wells Fargo is getting enough bad publicity that it decides it needs to do something proactive in responding to the problem. So it basically gets in touch with the lawyers at the NAACP and offers to build a new financial literacy center down in the U Street corridor in Washington, D.C. It offers several $1 million for an annual conference and convention, and then proceeds to become one of the chief donors to the NAACP for a series of financial education seminars. In other words, Wells Fargo goes from the litigation department to the donor department inside the walls of the country's preeminent civil rights organization. This was created as a condition of discriminatory intent. I want to close for a minute because I know I'm running short on time. And I just want to have us ponder for a moment the future of this great city and the cities around the country. We have a way of believing that ownership and suburbanization is the path to prosperity. And again, we think about these in the abstract rather than thinking about the history and the constant pursuit of ownership that then simply creates new points of predation. Wherever two or more Negroes are gathered, to use the old language. Therein lies a market. Therein lies a market. Many of you don't buy your groceries at the airport or try to buy things for your toys, or toys for your children, excuse me, at Disney World because you know it's too expensive. Once you get through those gates, there's not a whole lot you can do, right? Living in many corners of urban America and suburban America increasingly is like living in Disney World without the rides, right? Higher costs for everything. As of 2005, the majority of poor people in this country actually live in the suburbs. They don't live in the cities. As of 2005, this is now a 10-year-old condition. It's only gotten worse. Today's suburbs, 40% of the country's African Americans, 60% of its Asians, more than half of its Latinos all live in the suburbs. The browning of suburbia in and of itself does not mean an end to predation, as I already pointed out. Ownership rates declined for black folk as they moved into the suburbs in many instances. My grandparents were the first black family to move into their block in the 1970s, like 1979 in South Florida. They bought a 3-bedroom house, 2 bathrooms for $73,000. $73,000. It's still in our family. And after 20 years, my grandmother only paid $9,000 off the principal. She had to refinance several times. She had a daughter who had to be bailed out of jail, caught in the crack epidemic, another daughter who needed a high-end rehab facility because she got caught in the powder cocaine scene of the 1980s with her white suburban friends, also caused my grandmother to have to leverage her house yet again. And this was part of her own vision of what she had hoped would be the house that would support the entire family. $9,000 paid off the principal in 20 years. It's predation, not culture, that is our problem. And merely growing the pie is not going to help us. I'm happy to talk about possible ways forward. I would hope that we would think very long and hard. I see a lot of big brains in the room about what it would mean to attack this problem at the level of local regulation, at the level of the legal structure around racial discrimination, and also at the level of rethinking what it means to build partnerships and real possibilities through an alliance between activists and business. Thank you very much. How much time do we have? Oh, is it no time for questions? Oh, seriously? I'm sorry. I've just been told we're 10 minutes over. I can't take questions. I apologize for that.
I mean, is there? Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Is there? Did you have a question?
I do.
Okay. We can do one.
We'll break out for coffee. That's fine.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay.
I got you. All right. Thank you all very much. Really appreciate it.
So we're gonna go ahead and ask our panelists in this next panel to join us.
I'm supposed to sit down there, I guess. Okay.
Oh, it's here. Okay, yep. Wow, that was a great start. Thank you very much again to Dr. Connolly. And you know, when we start to think about the challenge of today, when the sort of challenge is laid out in the data, the history is clear, it's evidenced, it's continuing. We know that these are issues that are compounded only with time. We think about this opportunity, and this is the opportunity really around research and the role that research can play as we think about city policy and the articulation of city policy, and our work as we think about what is our data telling us today? What are the insights that we are listening to, what are the insights that we are not listening to, and how is it that we change course for impact. And so, as I referenced earlier this morning, we are so fortunate to be part of the 21st Century Cities Initiative, and with that comes an incredible advisory committee that sits with us and walks with us on these journeys that we're taking to have these impacts in cities. And we're joined today by a number of our partners from our advisory committee, but also across our campus, who are influencing our work on a regular basis, who are pairing with our cities and partnering, particularly here with our city in Baltimore. And we are just so pleased to have them. The ability to be able to have world-class knowledge at our fingertips in the areas of public safety, economic development, housing, education, and health is unparalleled. We are so uniquely positioned to have an impact in your communities, in the work that you're doing in your cities. And today, we hope that while you're here, you make also those meaningful connections so that we can bring and pair and really start to think about what does it look like for next level partnership between the academic community and leadership in cities as you start to think about your most tangible challenges. So at the, again, this moment, as we start thinking about it, think today as you go throughout the day, as we have these conversations, how can we help facilitate deeper connections so that the meaning in the research and the meaning in thinking about the use of data and evidence is not only resonating for us as an academic institution, but for you as you go about your daily work. So our panel this morning, thank you so much for being here and for joining us and for being our colleagues and for being our mentors. We are joined today by Lindsay Thompson from the Carey School of Business. We're not sitting in order, so I'm sorry. I'm going to introduce you. Maybe if you can just, give a wave or and she'll share some work and case studies on economic inclusion. Daniel Webster, professor of health and policy and management, will speak to us about reducing gun violence in American cities. Andrew Cherlin, our friend and colleague and advisor, the Benjamin H. Griswold III Professor of Public Policy, will present on the effects of incarceration on children and families. And again, another one of our trusted advisors, Deborah Gross from the School of Nursing, who will tell us that what city leaders should know about strengthening parenting capacities in early childhood. And finally, Andy Smerek, visiting scholar, School of Education from Johns Hopkins University, will be discussing educational policy and how it can affect real change. Thank you all so much for being here, for being part of this important dialogue, and for joining us today as we start to really think about how we roll up our sleeves and do this work in our cities and having these impacts in our communities. So without further ado, Lindsay, I think you're up first.
Okay, good. Yeah, but I'm just gonna. These are just some pictures that are a backdrop of the complexity and diversity of Baltimore City. And most of the not pretty pictures are from my neighborhood. And the pretty pictures are mostly from neighborhoods around the harbor where our business school is. I'm a business professor, and of course now I'm feeling like a predator. So I'd really like to talk about, are there ways, this is our challenge as a business school, are there ways that we can do business in a different way, that we can think about business in a different way, so that the challenges of our cities can really become, we can create solutions. Because business doesn't have to be the problem, it can be part of the solution. So I'd like to frame this as a big experiment. Our cities are a big lab. And the livability of cities, as you all know, will determine not only our future as a species, but the future of the planet. So the lab that we're talking about, our cities, is not in the ivory tower. It's out in the streets. It's in our homes. It's in our neighborhoods. And so we got this idea of how do we work in this lab? We have to get outside of our school. We have to go into the neighborhoods. We have to be there, live there, work there, and be part of it. And the thing about this lab, the cities that we're all living in, is there's no one really in charge. That's the really scary thing, is all of this kind of chaotic, disruptive stuff is going on. So we have to prepare our next generation of students as professionals. Whatever they're going to be doing in cities. And we have to prepare them to live and work in this lab in a way that creates new knowledge and new practices and new solutions to problems that are getting more and more serious and more threatening. So we are the lab. And if you think of all these global challenges, the United Nations has just identified 17 big challenges to the world. And really, you can boil them down to 5. And they all happen, and they're caused in cities, they're exacerbated in cities, but the solutions are also in the cities. Habitat, the ecosystems, people, the well-being of people and the flourishing of people, the resilience of communities as support systems for people, the engagement of people as citizens, and the raising of their voice in making decisions about their own lives and their own communities, and shared prosperity and inclusive wealth. So I want to focus on this wealth part, business development part. How do we do business in a different way that's not just recolonizing neighborhoods with the same old brands, the same old, you got to have a Starbucks. And if you look at, you've got to have, what are the brands that you see in every redevelopment, every cool city in America? They're the same things. Why can't we turn that upside down and inside out? Instead of bringing in the big box stores and jobs from the familiar brands that we all know, why can't we create new brands? Why can't we invest in the people who are already there and provide them with the credit, provide them with the business and skills and technology, all the things that they need to do to build their own new brands? Does it have to mean that all these business strips look the same? And so that's kind of our premise in this neighborhood that we've adopted, which is very close to our school, kind of between the business school and the hospital and the medical campus. It's an area of the oldest neighborhood in Baltimore City. In 1661, David Jones, an English Quaker, decided the first colonist in Baltimore City, in the Baltimore Inner Harbor, he decided to build a house, and this became Jonestown. So this neighborhood has been started and destroyed, restarted and destroyed for hundreds of years. It's a neighborhood where I've decided to live. There are about 11,000 people in the neighborhood there and adjacent to Jonestown. But it's surrounded by downtown, by Harbor East and Little Italy and Fells Point, which are, upscale neighborhoods. Now Harbor Point, which is a new upscale neighborhood. And the thinking is, the business thinking is development is going to reach up and this neighborhood is going to be transformed. So part of what we've been doing in this neighborhood is, no, that doesn't have to be the story. That neighborhood itself and those surrounding neighborhoods that, by the way, were all public housing projects, some are. So there's an area of about 85 acres is the neighborhood of Jonestown. But there's a larger area between, of maybe 4 times that size, that has these 11,000 people. All of these people have ideas. All of these people have business ideas that could be turned into something that could become a different brand, a new brand, a global brand possibly. And so the first thing that we've done in our lab in trying to develop this business, this new business from the inside, is we decided to map the businesses. Now, everybody was telling us, there isn't much going on in these neighborhoods, and the only way that we can create jobs is we have to bring in new jobs. There are actually, in this 85-acre area that's Jonestown, there are 150 incorporated entities. 50 of those are actually small businesses that make money and have employees. they're practically invisible. If you were riding down the street and walking down the street, they wouldn't look like much. But we've started talking to them. We're developing a business association and a business strategy. They all have ideas about how they could grow their business. They all have ideas about what it would take to do that, the kind of financing they need. And so what we're doing over the next, it'll probably take 5 or 10 years, is doing our own business plan with them about how do we grow these corridors that connect the neighborhoods along the north shore of the harbor, so that we build brands and we build businesses and we build communities that create microeconomies that exchange with each other. And it doesn't have to be all money from the outside. We can create our own new wealth. Now I want to say something about why we need to take this approach. It's not just about predation, but the way the economy has changed in Baltimore and for all cities is we have kind of what's going on is the global cotillion. Capital is very mobile, even people are mobile, but cities are anchored in place. So businesses are etherized. The value that's being created, 80% of the market trade right now is intangible value. That's etherization. Now think about that. The kinds of jobs that people had in 1970 when 80% of the market value of business was tangible, is you needed to move stuff around. Now 80% of the value is it's like an app. So this brings us to education. What kind of education do people need when what they have to do for jobs is create value that's intangible? That's a very different kind of education. So I do want to point out that we are not educating, and I think you all know this, we're not educating our kids to create wealth in that economy. But it's also something that is connected to how mobile everything is. So the businesses that we need to be creating in our community are those kinds of brands that the value can be anywhere. I'm trying to get to a slide. This is our business school. So I think in sum, what I'd like to say is we're turning business inside out. It's not that we don't welcome neighborhoods like this and developments like this, but all the wealth that's coming into the city also needs to invest in the people who are already here. And so what we're doing in our business school is preparing our students as business leaders to be part of that experiment where can we really build wealth from the inside of our cities, from the people who have been undervalued and undercapitalized, from the neighborhoods that have been undervalued and undercapitalized. We believe that we can do it, and we're starting right in Jonestown.
That's me. All right. Hi, good morning. Daniel Webster. I direct the Center for Gun Policy and Research here at Johns Hopkins. But I'm going to focus on and tell you first about a new initiative that formally got launched this year. Frankly, we've been working on this in some ways for a long time, but really formalized it this year, something we call the Johns Hopkins Baltimore Collaborative to Reduce Violence. And it is a partnership between Johns Hopkins. Initially, it was just with the police department. This, of course, is on the heels of 2015, where we had our highest per capita murder rate, I think, in history of the city, and obviously important and dramatic problems identified that came to great unrest and subsequent violence. So our mission is to help the city reduce violence, but also importantly do so in a way that begins to rebuild and improve relations, particularly between law enforcement and communities. What we bring to the table and what we're trying to do, of course, is help assess effectiveness of current strategies, try to promote more data-driven approaches and using data to manage those programs as well. One enormous problem that Baltimore's had that's not unique to Baltimore, but getting cooperation to help solve crimes. Gun violence in particular is a very contagious process. When someone is shot, if they don't rely upon the police or help the police solve that crime, they in essence solve it themselves with another shooting. So key to this effort is better ways to elicit information from citizens to help solve violent crimes. In order to do a lot of these things, we have to help Baltimore police be more reflective of the communities at which it polices. So one of our areas that we're focusing on is addressing policy and other issues that are barriers to them recruiting individuals that come from the communities that they police. And we're also working on helping the department on foot patrol, crisis intervention, particularly with individuals with mental health problems. That's a very common scenario that leads to police-related shootings. And much of our focus is on a gun strategy, reducing gun violence, and I'm going to talk about and tell you a little bit about the sort of background evidence that's going to inform our work. One strategy to reduce gun violence that became popular in the 1990s when gun violence was peaking in the United States in many cities, including Baltimore, were to train and deploy specialized police units whose principal job was to go into the places where the shootings tended to occur at the times they tended to occur, and have their singular focus be on identifying individuals illegally carrying guns and make that a riskier proposition. Part of the idea was to get guns off the street, but more importantly, it was a deterrence model. The question, of course, can this be done legally and fairly? And I believe that it can, but there are enormous challenges. What we've learned over a span of decades now is that these units very, very consistently reduce shootings. We've seen it in a number of cities, and I'll tell you about our own experience in Baltimore. It's been deployed in slightly different ways, but generally has a very good track record of success. I think where we sort of got off on the rails and there is much greater question of both the effectiveness and legality and appropriateness of this is when it's on a much broader scale as was used in New York City. And so we're sort of the idea of stop and frisk is certainly out of favor and should be reconsidered. But I want to make a distinction between that kind of approach as opposed to a much more focused approach. So that's where the direction that I think we're heading, which leads me into another strategy, an evidence-based strategy, something generally in the academic world referred to as focused deterrence, popularized by initially by David Kennedy, his early work in Boston that has grown. The general idea is that it's very risk-focused. You're going to identify, using available data, the people who are driving violence in communities, and you're going to, in essence, hold a variety of levers, criminal justice levers, over them. The idea is not simply to make a lot of arrests, but to use that in a more effective deterrence way. And the key to this really is effective communication. They do this often through call-ins. It's been complemented in recent years, I think, very appropriately. So the messages going to these offenders or potential offenders is not simply a message coming from a police commissioner or a state's attorney, but it is actually people from the community, a moral voice from the community as part of those call-ins. Also importantly, their offers of service to try to give them alternatives to the path that has led them to be involved in violence. And then again, do this all in a manner that demonstrates fairness. Fairness is important not only because we're after justice as well as safety, but it also turns out to be important in terms of whether people actually buy in or not. To buy in, they have to feel that it is fair. The track record is pretty good for this. One meta-analysis found that for the interventions that were focused on gangs and gun violence, 7 out of 8 showed reductions, and the reductions were fairly substantial, far more than any other interventions that I'm familiar with. When this has been applied principally to try to address illegal drug selling in and of itself, not the violence from it, the track record is not as good, with perhaps an exception of one trial in High Point, North Carolina. But the effect's not nearly as big. Another intervention completely outside of the law enforcement context is something that now goes under a brand of cure violence. It's a public health approach developed by individuals who initially worked in infectious disease control and recognized the parallels in gun violence in the contagious process. The key elements of this involve identifying credible messengers who are close to the, can relate to and from the communities for the offenders that they need to reach, the same ones that the focused deterrence is trying to reach, same idea. And they are trying to do principally 3 things. One is very directly interrupt violence or mediate conflicts, particularly between groups that with histories of violence, because those are contagious processes that can get out of hand. They want to, through that process, try to change social norms about how you deal with conflicts, and then try to also, again, steer them towards productive paths. I'll tell you a little bit about our history in Baltimore on this. The track record of this is mixed, I'd say. There's some really ringing success stories and some not. So it's a challenge to implement. We just completed an analysis looking at data from 2007 in Baltimore through the end of 2015 to examine all the different strategies Baltimore has tried to use to reduce homicides and gun violence. And I'll just briefly give you the highlights of this. The program, so the different interventions were Safe Streets, which was the cure violence model that I mentioned. The violent crime impact section was the principally the gun offender and gun carrying suppression units. These were disbanded in, they were started in 2007, disbanded in 2012. Something called a gun offender registry. That's not exactly like a sex offender registry, but it's more of a process where police can better monitor the people with gun history arrests that tend to be predictive of future murder offending. The ceasefire model, which is the focused deterrence that I described, and a more recently something that we're calling the trigger pullers program that is focused again on these high-risk individuals. This is just generally just to show you the red line here is the non-fatal shootings, and homicides is the blue line. So there was some notable progress that the city had, particularly from beginning in 2008. But as you see here, 2015, things reversed quite dramatically and suddenly. What we found is when our new commissioner for BFL came in and shifted focus from drugs to guns. We had significant reductions in homicides, 19%, 24% in non-fatal shootings. Under our more current Commissioner Davis, that again sort of refocused in a somewhat similar way, we saw a reduction in shootings of 23%. The Safe Streets strategy, if you're looking at specific interventions, actually had the strongest effect in reducing shootings compared to the various law enforcement strategies, 27% reduction on average. The effects on homicide, however, were varied across the different 5 sites that we studied. This gun carrying suppression unit was associated with 20% reduction in shootings, and in some periods with reductions in homicides as well. Drug enforcement was a complicated puzzle. Basically, when there were what we called surges, big increases in trying to arrest people in drug distribution sales, we actually tended to see increases in shootings following that. More targeted efforts to bring down violent drug gangs, however, at least temporarily had suppressed some shootings, at least up to 6 months. Ceasefire, the model that was so successful in most other cities, however, associated with more violence. So looking ahead, what our focus is going to be on, again, is focus more on our problem here is people are getting away with a lot of illegal gun use, so we need greater certainty. We're going to be far more risk-focused. I think we're gradually shifting our orientation to drugs in a very healthy way. And then I think the key will be trying to bring together the public health and the law enforcement, particularly when there are takedowns that can disrupt illegal drug markets.
I'm Andy Cherlin from the Sociology Department in the School of Arts and Sciences here. Thanks very much for coming this morning to hear it from us. I want to talk with you about the effects of parental incarceration on children. I study American families worldwide, and this is a growing problem that's really quite troubling. Over half of all prisoners have children under 18. So there are many, many prisoners who have parents, who have kids, and many children who are now at an increased risk of having an incarcerated parent. The problem is worse for kids whose parents haven't finished high school. And among them, the numbers are really shocking. 62% of all black children will have a parent incarcerated before age 18 if they are living with parents who have not graduated from high school. 62%. 15% of white children will have a parent incarcerated before age 18. Now that white number is much, much lower than the African American number, but it is by itself shocking. That's still 15%. That's still almost 1 out of every 6 white kids whose parents have not graduated from high school. So yes, there are important racial aspects of this we can't forget about, but it's not just a racial problem. It's a class problem, it's a family problem, and something we will need to deal with. So the problem also exists, though, for children whose parents have a high school education, which is a massive amount of kids in this country. 16% of black children will have a parent incarcerated before age 18. And 4% of white kids will have a parent incarcerated before age 18. So this means if you're a teacher in a school in a working class area where most kids have parents with a high school education, you would expect if you have 25 students, a little math will tell you probably 4 or 5 of those kids will have a parent in jail at any one time among black kids. And among the white kids in your class, 1 out of 25. If you have a 25-person class, you can expect 1 white kid to have a parent who's incarcerated in every single class you teach all day long. This is what the numbers tell us and why this is such a big problem. And as someone who studies families, what's really kind of shocking and ultimately saddening to me is the extent to which parental incarceration has now become a life cycle stage in the lives of families in the groups we're talking about. You go to school, you drop out, you have some kids, you go to jail. You're born, you have parents. At any one time, you and your cousins and your friends, a lot of them have a parent who's incarcerated, and it's just a normal part of family life. In some areas of New York City, there's now bus service on Sundays where a bus pulls up to certain corners, and it takes people up to the upstate New York prisons to see their relatives who are in jail. It's a commercial activity. It's part of the daily routine. It is built into family life in a way that's truly shocking and saddening, and is certainly a reality for us now as we think about these issues. The consequences of all this for kids, which, as you can imagine, they're very large. The best evidence suggests that for kids, it leads to more physically aggressive behavior, having a parent incarcerated, especially for boys. And there's some evidence that it leads to attention problems, which makes it harder to do well in school. So the problems can be really serious and can be just the kinds of problems that result in a kid getting in trouble in school, not finishing a grade, having educational difficulties, getting in trouble with the law himself or herself. And why is this happening? Well, there are a number of factors, and we really don't know for sure. The sheer fact of separation from a parent is certainly something you would suggest could have difficulties for kids. In addition, there's a great amount of family instability in these families, as parents and sometimes brothers or sisters are incarcerated, come back, go back. Other parent substitutes, boyfriends, girlfriends enter the house while incarceration is going on. A great amount of churning and instability, which itself can be hard on children when they're growing up. And finally, there's the stigma of prison. Your dad finally comes back from prison, but it's very hard for him to get a job because he's got a conviction on his record. It's really hard for anyone to hire him. So those are the consequences. The solution to this, of course, is to reduce incarceration. But in the meantime, what can we do to help these kids? Well, I've asked around to learn what is the most effective program, the most effective organization we have nationally, and I've been told by many people it's a group that's called the San Francisco Children of Incarcerated Parents Partnership. There is the website number. This is a group that's been very influential since it started in about 2000. It's gotten the state of California's legislature to pass several measures. It has gotten the San Francisco Police Department and police departments nearby to change their procedures. It's been influential in starting similar groups in New York and Los Angeles and other ways. The Annie E. Casey Foundation sponsored a booklet for social workers on how to deal with kids with incarcerated parents. That was written by the coordinator of this group. So there are other groups for sure, but I want to give you this as an example of a group that seems to be doing the best. Their claim to fame is what they call a Bill of Rights for children of incarcerated parents, an 8-proposition bill that they put out as an exercise in learning and thinking about what we need to do about this problem. First, I have the right to be kept safe and informed at the time of my parents' arrest. The group says we need to develop arrest protocols that support and protect children, and we need to offer them and their caregivers basic information about the post-arrest process, so a child is left as little as possible in the fearsome position of not knowing what's going on, not knowing what's going to happen, being confused and disoriented. I have the right to be heard when decisions are made about me. Train staff at institutions whose constituencies include the children of incarcerated parents and recognize and address these kids' needs. Tell the truth to them. Don't sugarcoat it. Tell them what's going to happen. Tell them the truth so that they understand and listen to them. I have the right to be considered when decisions are made about my parent. We ought to review sentencing law in terms of its impact on children and families, turn arrests into an opportunity for family preservation, not family deterioration and destruction. Include a family impact statement in pre-sentence investigation reports. I have the right to be well cared for in my parents' absence. Wish to support kids by supporting their caregivers and authorizing subsidized guardianship when possible. I have the right to speak with, see, and touch my parent. Provide access to visiting rooms that are child centers, non-intimidating, and conducive to bonding. Encourage proximity to families when you're thinking about what prison to put someone who's just been convicted into. And encourage child welfare departments to facilitate contact. I have the right to support as I face my parents' incarceration. Train adults who work with young people to recognize the needs and concerns of kids with incarcerated parents and provide access to specially trained therapists, counselors, and mentors. I have the right to not to be judged, blamed, or labeled because my parent is incarcerated. Create opportunities for these kids to communicate with and to support them. And finally, I have a right to a lifelong relationship with my parents. Designate a family services coordinator at prisons and jails. Support incarcerated parents upon reentry. Focused on rehabilitation and alternatives to incarceration. This is their Children's Bill of Rights. Many of these planks have led to changes in legislation and practices in the areas that they've been active in. I have about 20 copies of a one-pager for the group if you're interested. I'd be happy to talk with you about it and give you that information. And I hope I have reinforced what I'm sure was already in your minds, the serious problem we now have as an insidious side effect of mass incarceration, namely the huge amounts of American children who are dealing with a parent who is incarcerated. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Debbie Gross. I'm from the School of Nursing at Johns Hopkins University. And I don't know if you know this, but children's health has changed dramatically. Currently, it used to be, well, right now, the top 5 disabilities, chronic disabilities affecting children in the United States are all social, behavioral, and developmental. Asthma is number 6. And these problems are more than twice as likely to occur among children living in poverty. One of the reasons that poverty has this distinct effect on children's mental health is because poverty increases the likelihood that children are going to be exposed to multiple adverse childhood experiences, such as parent loss through incarceration, maltreatment, exposure to violence, and other things. Children exposed to 2 or more ACEs are almost 3 times more likely to be retained in grade and about twice as likely to be diagnosed with ADHD or other behavior problems. In Baltimore City, over 85% of school children live in poverty, and over 30% of children are exposed to 2 or more ACEs. In a survey recently of Baltimore City high school students, 43% of the students reported witnessing violence at least weekly. 39% knew somebody who had killed before reaching adulthood. Elijah Anderson refers to this not as the achievement gap, but as the risk gap. And this is an important distinction, because if we call it an achievement gap, we focus on schools, teachers, and education policy. If we call it a risk gap, we focus on neighborhoods, health, and urban policies. In Baltimore City, over half of the children enter kindergarten not being socially and behaviorally ready to learn. These are the skills that were sometimes called the non-cognitive skills, such as managing and understanding emotions, executive functioning skills like the ability to sit still, attend to tasks, process and manage information, problem solve, follow instructions, and inhibiting socially inappropriate responses and behaviors, being able to accurately understand the emotions of others around you. These are the skills that children are expected to learn at home, from their families, and before they enter school. So we wanted to understand, what is the impact of children not entering kindergarten socially and behaviorally ready to learn? And we studied over 9,000 children who are in kindergarten in Baltimore City schools. This is a study that I did with my colleagues Amy Betancourt and Grace Ho in collaboration with the Baltimore Education Research Consortium. And we examined 3 academic outcomes: being retained in grade, receiving services and supports through an IEP or 504 plan, or being suspended or expelled sometime between kindergarten and 3rd grade. And we really wanted to isolate the unique impact just of the social behavioral readiness. So we controlled for demographic variables, we controlled for chronic absence from kindergarten, their level of income, whether they attended pre-K or other formal preschool experience, and all of the other domains of cognitive readiness. And what we found is that by 3rd grade, students assessed as not socially behaviorally ready to learn in kindergarten were up to 80% more likely to be retained in grade. They were up to 80% more likely to receive services and supports through an IEP or a 504 plan. And they were up to 7 times more likely to be suspended or expelled at least once by 3rd grade. And these are costly outcomes. So the cost of grade retention is the cost of an additional year of school. The cost of an IEP or a 504 plan varies by the level of disability, but it's been estimated that on average, it's about $10,000 per child per year of additional services. And the cost of suspensions and expulsions are difficult to also calculate. I have not been able to find any data on that yet, but it is the cost of the staff time to address the behavioral incident, the lost school funding from the student's absence from school, lost parent wages from having to deal with the problem and having to stay home to supervise the child or to hire somebody else to supervise your child, and the increased likelihood of later school dropout and involvement with the juvenile justice system. So to address this problem, because we're academics, we're not just about the problem, but trying to solve the problem. We've been funded by 6 local foundations in Baltimore City for a 3-year study called the CHIP Project, where we're building parenting skills and parent engagement in pre-K, because again, we can't hold all this on the backs of teachers. These are the skills that are learned at home. And we offered it, an evidence-based parenting program called the Chicago Parent Program. We went to schools that served over 90% low-income families. And we used, to boost participation rates, we included a conditional cash transfer program. I'm going to report on the 9 schools that have completed so far. We have about 2, and we particularly focused on parents of pre-K, only because in this study that we wanted to be able to link, we are going to be linking it to their kindergarten readiness scores in the following year. Most are single-parent mothers, but we have fathers and we have grandparents in the study, almost all families of color. The vast majority of the parents completed high school or less, and 2/3 of the families reported incomes less than $20,000 per year. And although we do not recruit, it's a universal program, we do not recruit specifically for children with high rates of behavior problems. Over 40% of the children of the parents who enrolled in the CHIP project have behavior problems in what we call the clinical range, which is behavior problems that are at least 1 standard deviation above population norms. The results to date are 48% drop in children's behavior problems after the program is over. It's having a significant impact on children's behavior. 61% of the parents report the concerns they now have are much better than before. 69% say that the programs like this have helped them a lot with relationships other than with their child. 75% feel much more confident talking to the child's teacher about their child's behavior, and 96% say that programs like this make them feel valued by their child's school. And I want to talk about the conditional cash transfer programs. We knew that if we couldn't get parents to come, the whole program was doomed. And prevention programs in general are very hard to get parents to participate in. So when parents signed up, they got a bank debit card. And they were told that every time they attended the 2-hour parent group session, they got $15 loaded onto their debit card. And every time they practiced the skill building assignment that they had every week, because we tell parents, no one changes their behavior by attending a meeting. You gotta go out and do that with your child. They got another $5 loaded on their debit card. So a maximum of $230 for the program. Not much money. We also, at baseline, asked them what motivated them to sign up, and they had a checklist of about 13 different things that could motivate their participation, including the money, but also aspects about parenting or wanting to be with other parents and meet other parents. 73% of the parents did check off money as a motivator. But this is important. 96% said the most important motivator for signing up was wanting to be a better parent and wanting help with parenting. And 80% of the parents who signed up attended. And of those who attended, they attended 8 out of the 12 sessions. And we also measured parent engagement rates because we wanted to know, are they coming just for the money, or are they coming, are we getting butts in the chair or hearts in the room? And we had the group leaders measure using a measure of parent engagement. Whoops, right up. Parent engagement was very high. We know that the secret to this is sustaining programs like this, and all of the schools now are investing in sustaining the program after the funding is over. But I want to give a shout out to Judy Centers, which are 2-generation programs in the state of Maryland. They are written into Maryland law, and they focus on building, strengthening parenting capacities and family capacities in the first 5 years of life. Take-home points. These are it. Growing up in poverty is having a devastating effect on young children's social and behavioral readiness to learn. Social behavioral readiness is first learned at home before children enter school in the context of a strong parenting relationship. Although preschool enrichment and teacher development programs are important, and they are, we have to invest more in strengthening parenting capacities. School-based parenting programs can benefit families when they are evidence-based, strength-based, relevant to the issues that are faced by parents raising young children in urban poverty, and nested in community schools, interventions in place. And Judy Centers, written into law, supported by public and private dollars and located in schools, is an innovative and replicable strategy for supporting parents. And finally, conditional cash transfer programs are effective if done right for engaging low-income families in health-promoting programs. Thank you.
You for a couple minutes about public schools. In fact, what I want to do is actually suggest to you that there's a different way of using data. That is not using the data that we have currently, but I want to encourage you to engage with a collection of different data, because we're trying to accomplish some different things, at least when we think about what we've been doing over the past generation or so. So in short, my gist here is that I want to suggest a different way for mayors and city leaders to think about working with their public education systems. Rather than just thinking about how do we raise student achievement, what boys and girls are learning, think about this much more in terms of how is it that we are going to distribute power from where it currently is housed to a range of different people and organizations. Namely, how do we make sure that families, community-based organizations, and educators have more and more authority? That way, the city leaders can start to see, you can start to see your role developing an education strategy as part of a much bigger strategy on community development. So, traditionally, the way that we have gone about talking about city leaders engaging in their system of public schools is what generally we've called the district takeover. The idea is that a city leader, like a mayor, wants to have more influence over his or her schools, so they petition the governor or the legislature to give the mayor's office control over the district. So you put it underneath of the mayor. The mayor gets to choose who the superintendent is, gets to make the school board go away. Essentially what you're doing here is making the school system an executive branch agency. An analog to this that's been tried, and this first thing, this district takeover, has probably happened in about a dozen or so cities over the past 2 decades. The other approach that's similar is getting allies on your school board. The mayor actually tries to find a slate of candidates who he or she runs and helps them get elected. The idea being, if the mayor, the city's leaders, can have a bunch of friends and colleagues on the school board is aligned, they hire a superintendent who's in line, and then there's a team of people throughout the city government who can run the district. This has sort of been the standard operating procedure for thinking about how mayors get much more involved in K-12 schooling. Lots of people will tell you this is the way to go, that the district is the system. If mayors and city leaders want to be involved, this is what they have to do. I, however, want to suggest that there may be a different way of going about this, maybe even a better way. The idea being that the mayor can get involved in a different path, but you have to think differently about what you're trying to do. The thrust here is that that way of taking over the district, getting involved in it, ends up tying the mayor's hands in a whole host of different ways. Controlling the existing system not only gives you all of the power over the possibilities of the existing system, it also puts all of the burdens, all the complications of that system right in the city's leaders' laps. So you don't just get the potential, what you get is the old school union contracts, the countless rules, the giant central office, the bureaucratic mindset, and the politics more than anything else. So you're getting all of this at the same time that you're getting more and more power. So what I want to encourage city leaders to think about is how do we get involved in public education outside of the district system? Now, this may seem crazy, because what exactly does that mean to get involved in public education outside of the district? For many of us, the idea of public education and the district are actually synonymous. To have one is to have the other. One represents the entirety of the other. Public education is the district, right? How can you get involved in something outside of it? What this actually means for city leaders is entrepreneurialism, being able to be nimble and using state laws that are already available to you to create a space outside of the district to do the things you care about. Just historically, this becomes important because 100 years ago, your state legislatures created public education to be what some people call the only game in town. The district was going to own and operate all public schools in a geographic area, and that's how it's been for a century. But about 25 years ago, states started thinking differently about it. They said, maybe we can have public education, but not have it be entirely represented by the district. So you as city leaders can think about public education as a space and think of the district sector as being a part of that, but also thinking of these other kind of laws often thought of as the charter school, the independent nonprofit public school sector that you can get more and more involved in. Now, this is important for the idea of developing community because this new sector operates differently. It distributes power in a way that the previous sector did not. In this new sector, families get to choose where their kids go to school. Educators get to choose where they're going to teach. Community-based organizations get to decide whether or not they're going to start schools. Now, many of you know about there's a growing body of research showing that urban charter schools are getting these outsized gains when there are good laws in place related to test scores and graduation rates and so forth. Not all charters are great. Not all independent public schools are going to get the job done. But increasingly, there's a body of data showing that when you get the policies and practices right, you can create a high-performing dynamic system of schools. But what's been entirely lost in this conversation is how this new system shifts power. And I think that's what is so important for city leaders to think about. It takes power from a 100-year-old district administrative office and hands it out, distributes it. It relinquishes power to the people in your communities. Instead of a district central administrator or a school board getting to tell everybody what to do, power is actually flipped. So think about it this way. Families now get power. No one's going to assign their kids to schools. Moms and dads and grandparents get to say, I know what's best for my kids. Teachers aren't going to be told by a district central administrator, you have to teach at Johnson Elementary, when the teacher may want to teach at Kennedy Elementary. This is now going to be in the hands of teachers. Community-based organizations get to decide if they want to start schools. In short, the old system was developed with the idea of being technocratic, that a central office had all the right answers. And what I'm suggesting to you is if we think about changing city politics, city power, we have to start to trust our people, trust our communities more, meaning handing power off to them. Just think about this single example. Who has power in the old system when the district says, you live at 123 Main Street, therefore we are going to assign you to this school? That's the old way. What happens if you have a range of schools and you say to families, you know best, you're in charge? This has a revolutionary effect, hopefully, on the way these systems are developing. So just in terms of next steps, what are the things that city leaders can do along these lines? The first is think about becoming a charter school authorizer. The mayor of Indianapolis actually has had this power for more than a decade. So the mayor isn't in charge of running schools. The mayor is in charge of being an engine of new school creation and accountability. Nonprofits come to the mayor's office. The mayor's office decides whether or not they're going to approve the school, and then they oversee it. So currently, probably the mayor's office in Indianapolis is overseeing somewhere between, call it 15, 20% of the kids, public school kids, and the schools that those kids are in the city. So that's one. Second is help incubate new schools. Many of your cities probably take for granted that you should incubate new small businesses so you can create jobs for your city. Why not be involved as mayors, as city leaders, in incubating new public schools? You don't have to run the schools yourselves, but you can talk to your community and say, do we want more career tech high schools? Do we want more college prep middle schools? Then you can work with CBOs and other philanthropists so they can start to create schools and match that up with the demand of families. And the last is, I think, sort of trying to go full circle here with our discussion about data, is why don't you create a mayor's or a city's report card, a new way of talking about what matters most when it comes to our system of schools. Now, generally, for the past 20 years or so, states have had a report card. You can go online right now and find out the reading and math scores or graduation rates of any public school in America. But is that really what we care most about if we're trying to revolutionize, re-energize what it means to be a city resident or to be a city leader? Why don't you as city leaders think more about, if we're trying to decentralize power, if we're trying to give more authority to our community, why don't we have a report card that every year tells people how much progress we're making on that? And so we are going to change the debate by telling people how these things are shifting. So for example, what percentage of families are now choosing their schools as opposed to being assigned to schools by somebody else? What percentage of our teachers and administrators are actually teaching or leading in schools that they chose as opposed to being assigned to? How many different options at the high school level are available to our high school kids? Are they being assigned, or can they pick from a range of different schools? How many nonprofits are involved in this work? What percentage of parents are satisfied? You sort of see where this is going. But where this all begins and ends is the idea that we have had a system for a long time that was based on the idea that a central authority could get everything right, and it would lead all of the contracts and lead all of the decisions on assignments and so forth. If we actually think that part of the problem with city governance is that there are too many people with too little power, let's think differently about our schools. And that means handing off more authority to parents, to nonprofit organizations, and educators, and having city leaders be part of that new discussion. Thank you.
Thanks to that great panel. Can we get one more round of applause for the whole panel? So everyone will have the chance to interact with the panelists and others when we break out into our small groups. I wish that we had more time for Q&A, but again, we've baked in a lot of content today and yesterday. I think one of the biggest lessons learned from the symposium is we need to leave more time for networking and questions because there's so much content and there's so much opportunity. That everyone has enjoyed this morning's sessions. I know that I had a wonderful time popping in and listening to the conversations. I think that this is just a bit of a tease, just getting these conversations started, making these relationships. And one of the things that I know that Dr. Eden and Ben and I talk a lot about is how do we nurture these connections that are made in spaces like this. And so it's something that we'll be thinking a lot about, but would love also to hear your feedback on how we can help you nurture these connections and keep these dialogues going. I do hope that you were all able to at least identify one or two people that you want to follow up with. Again, remember that GovX is here for you and as a way to help to not only make those connections, but to really support those connections and to make sure that we can advance your work as it relates to your thinking about how you can use critically data and evidence to really drive for outcomes in your city. So thank you very much. Part of this day is about taking this new approach. It's the longstanding challenges. It often means acknowledging that government needs partners in order to succeed, that they need to partner both with research universities, nonprofits. And so I just hope that we think about that in a new way. I'm going to go a little bit off script for 1 second. Sharon, don't kill me. And I want to invite Kathy up for just a second. This day really wouldn't have been possible without some very important help, and not just today, but also yesterday. So we really want to acknowledge the folks that were a part of putting together the day and for helping us sort of navigate and deal with all of the logistics, but also finding the subject matter expertise and all the content and really framing how it is that we were able to execute on the symposium overall. So if Ava and Catherine and Sharon could just come up, we wanted to just sort of thank you, and to really all of the work that you've poured into putting this together and thinking about this and making it such a successful event would not have been possible without you. So I just wanted to acknowledge you. So thanks. Thank you, Dr. Eden. So our next speaker, Dr. Philip Leaf, is the director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Prevention of Youth Violence. I've known Dr. Leaf since my days as a probation officer here in Baltimore City, where his work influenced a lot of the policies that I had the opportunity to see firsthand impacts on the front lines. He understands the importance of collaboration and sort of the spirit of collaboration that we tried to capture in the pairings of subject matter expertise and the work that you're doing in cities. And I think that it's incredibly important that we recognize that his center involves creating that academic community, but making deep connections into the work that the city is doing. And that's evidenced by collaborations for initiatives like Safe Streets, an evidence-based program in which JHU, the City Health Department, and community-based organizations work together to really invest in violence intervention through very rigorous community organizations. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Leaf and to thank him very much for participating in our day today.
Great. So I'm Dr. Philip Leaf. I direct a Center for Prevention of Youth Violence. I direct a Center for Adolescent Health. I'm the Senior Associate Director of our university-wide Urban Health Institute, and I'm here to help you. Now, that probably didn't go over very well. Those of you who actually now put yourself in a community context, and I walk in like that, or you don't even, or I walk in like this, and try to get involved. You know, there's a number of things. So how many people have heard of or know anything about Freddie Gray? Heard about it. So most people, keep your hands up. How many people were involved at all in Freddie Gray's life before he died, or had any participation with Freddie Gray before he died? I'll keep my hand up. Okay. Again, I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins. It's not necessarily one of the things when you look at me you think you do. And so rather than my telling you some of what I've done, I'm going to bring you into the Freddie Gray funeral. This is the end of the funeral where somebody just sort of acknowledged all the political people there, the mayor, the past mayor, Congressman Cummings, people who have come in to just sort of professionals who've come in and other things. And so let's see if this worked in practice. Here we go. Hold on.
That's awesome. Remain standing. Let me have that the Policy Creative Funeral representatives will come now. Policy Green. As it comes, we also thank God for Dr. Philip Leaf. Family wants to express appreciation to him. Particularly show him some love because he has been more than generous making this funeral possible for our very, very family. God bless you, Dr. Lee.
So I was actually the only person at the funeral family acknowledged. And how I made it possible was my work I'm doing in the community. Somebody let me know that they didn't have enough money for the funeral. There actually had been a GoFundMe site that somebody had posted up and gotten about $30,000, which actually was a phony GoFundMe site. And it got closed down. They'd already taken the money out of it. And so this is with lots of people, I don't want to say, people raising money for the family and others. Some of the work I've done, I actually got to know the family. You'll see some pictures of Freddie Gray's events before the uprising. So I went down to the funeral home and paid for what they needed to do the funeral. Now again, I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins. This is not one of the relationships you usually think of having. I think you have people in all your institutions, your cities, and other things. And I think one of the things that we've heard for the last 2 days is that relationships are really critical. And that we often don't have the right relationships, whether it's in the neighborhoods, from neighborhood to neighborhood. We think about youth as essentially somebody to study or cost as opposed to our future. We often look at people who are not like us as people who are at least neutral, if not enemies. And again, I think, and again, I'm not talking about you as individuals, because we also heard some really great references to activities done over the last 2 years, where some of the things that the mayors have done, some of the things that the researchers have done. But as we're thinking about community engagement, people in communities have lots of different roles. They're members of faith communities. They're raising their own children. They're working in their own schools. And I think they're really an under-tapped resource for going. Let's see if I can. Get me the next. How do I advance the slides? No?
Oh no. Now we need a professional.
So I'm going to, as we get somebody who can advance the slide. So the next slide is actually something saying, has a sign that says, "Get well soon, Freddie." There is an event, this is a Saturday before he died, where his family and his community had organized an event to try to essentially keep up their spirits. He was in a coma. He was not going to make it, but that was it. So just to sort of show that there are organized events, and with the exception of 2 or 3 other people, this were people from Gilmore Homes. Another question, does anybody know where Freddie Gray was living at the time he died? Go ahead. No, he wasn't living in Gilmore Homes. No, he wasn't living in Reservoir Hill, but it's closer. Gilmore Homes is the area where the police got him, and he was from that area. He actually was living about 8 blocks from Johns Hopkins, University, in the Able community. His sisters had bought a house with their lead money, and that's where he was living at the time. Now, he went back to where he had grown up, but again, as we're thinking about things, that's sort of not where he was living. Okay, here's sort of, again, these are not people from outside Baltimore coming to Baltimore. These are his friends. These are the people he grew up with, being concerned about what was going on. So the example is again, there's lots of things that are going on in your neighborhoods and communities, and how to think about people, how to develop those relationships. So some of the things that we've been doing, and part of it has got alluded to the issues of data. Well, how do we work with the community associations? How do we provide information so they can sort of understand the kind of data that we're asking the police to use, the governments to use? Because we've talked about involving more community people, and one of the things our Urban Health Institute does is run training sessions for communities and neighborhoods to do some of these trainings. Another thing that we're doing is that we're actually we've just recently, Johns Hopkins has gotten some funds from the Urban Health Institute. So this is actually the protest, that's the Western Police District. which is, again, right outside of where he was taken. Again, it's a community. This is the Penn North. So this is during now the official uprising, where this is the corner where the fires were. You can't see, off to the right a little bit is where the CVS broke down. But this is actually a basketball court. So this is the Tuesday after the uprising. Businesses closed. Hopkins was closed. I was supposed to have the police commissioner come talk to my class. The university closed down. All the universities closed down. Most of the businesses closed down. This is a basketball court with lots of folks. This was a basketball game organized by former and probably current gang members. And there were Bloods and Crips and other folks playing basketball together. They'd actually raised funds, and they had food for the community. So you see there's a lot of young folks there. And again, on this issue, this was not an his death was not something that the gang, essentially they wanted to be showing their support for the family and doing something positive. The schools are going to be closed. They were saying, well, what are the kids going to do? Let's have a basketball game. So this was actually arranged by a number of people still in the life, as well as some people formerly in the life. And there were some I ran into a principal there, and she was talking to some of her kids because she taught the school in that neighborhood. Again, there were some basketball games with people who are on different sides. Again, we think about neighborhoods and communities, and some of the people on some cases we may be very concerned about, they actually stepped up and organized the community programs. And so again, thinking about where our resources and what we can do. And then this is a Park Heights area where several of us do a lot of work. Please come again. Communities want to be welcoming. I think all the cities we talked about, the reason you're here is you're trying to make life better for yourself and for other folks. But again, what are the relationships that we need to do? We're talking about getting data, well, interpreting the data, having the resources. Who are the stakeholders who can make some of these changes in terms of the faith community? And increasingly, the young people themselves. The young people themselves are very entrepreneurial. They're working on developing businesses. Some of the ones we're most concerned are not necessarily legal businesses, but they're businesses. But one of the things that Johns Hopkins did, they had a social innovations lab. And they were interested in people who had entrepreneurial aspirations. And for the first couple of years, you had to either be a student or a faculty member or a staff person at Johns Hopkins to get in there. And there was actually some funding made available. There was also technical assistance and legal assistance. There was actually space. And about last year, they decided, well, wait a second. If we're trying to do things that will help Baltimore, why don't we just let Baltimore people also apply? We're not necessarily going to give them priorities or count it against them. And 3 of the 10 businesses that were going into this incubator that were supported were from people from Baltimore City that had absolutely nothing to do with Johns Hopkins. There are several people from the Baltimore City that were also involved in Johns Hopkins, so it wasn't necessarily only the 3 places. But again, these are examples as we think about some of the work we're doing differently and what we're trying to do, and that we might be able to make some headway. We talk about connecting the dots. I've used this a lot of times. It's really nice in grant proposals. But also, when you think about our examples, we're trying to make our little dot better. But often there isn't the ability or the capacity in some of these other dots, and so we link together things that aren't functioning so well. So how do we make these things more functional? What do we do instead of just connecting folks, really trying to develop things from scratch? And so one of the things that we've come up with working with our community partners is trying to think about pathways. That we want pathways to success. And this is a little model down at the bottom. There's a barrier in terms of thinking about Baltimore, where there's lots of folks trying to get into the successful opportunities, but they're not quite there yet. And we're creating these navigators. We're creating people who can be supporting people over their lifetime, or at least for 5, 10, 20 years. It's not just getting them out of high school into college, because we have huge dropout rates from Baltimore City of children that get into college. We have a huge number of people that get into college in April and don't show up in September because they don't have the supports for their family or other things to get there. Again, they often don't have another family member who's ever been to college themselves. The parents are saying, who's going to look after little Joey, your younger brother, or you used to be bringing in $15, $20 a week, working part-time, who's going to support that? So having people think those things through, and then importantly, one of the pathways is education. One is to business, but a third one is to entrepreneurship. We have a lot of entrepreneurs in Baltimore City, whether it's high tech or other kind of things. There are people that drive up to New York City to buy not buy drugs, but buy clothing and things and come back and sell it, because there's a lot of people that do clothing manufacturing up in New York City. So we have a lot of people in our city, and I'm willing to believe in all of your cities have these folks. So again, thinking about these things, and if we think about that's Johns Hopkins Hospital, one of our original buildings, the little circular thing is where the term rounding came into. The physicians used to go around, take the staff and then medical students around to see the people in the beds. That's where the term making rounds came from. It was actually invented here. Johns Hopkins was the first modern research institution. It was actually created without undergraduates initially. But the hospital and the university were created at the same time because they were both meant to serve people in Baltimore. Johns Hopkins had that in his will. That was his mission. I think, 100 and some odd years later, what we're trying to do is reinvent academic and city and collaborations, and this is what the last day and a half has been about. And again, I think sometimes when you see a university person, they actually may have some pretty good contacts in the community and be helpful. Not all of them, and obviously I don't have great contacts with everybody. Likewise, there's people in government, in the communities that also have great repertoires of expertise, and I think the more we can have people just working together, understanding some of these things, and I want to focus on the data because that's the thing a lot of us are focusing on, and many of the people I just talked about, that's not their skill. And so making sure that when we're trying to involve parents in schools, they're able to look at the school climate data, they're able to look at some of these things and participate in the decision making. So that's, I talked about the Homewood Community Partnership where we're working with neighborhoods around there. We have a community research day where the community comes up with the questions and we try to bring the academics and our students to help figure out how can we partner with them, but they are bringing what they need data for. We're training community leaders, I talked about that. We're trying to facilitate faculty, staff, and community engagements. And again, 21st Century Multi-City Consortium, I think, is again one more piece in the solution. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Leaf, very much. So we're up for our last speaker to close out the day, and I couldn't think of a better person to do it. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Jonathan Links. He is Johns Hopkins University's Vice Provost and also our Chief Risk Compliance Officer. That's just scratching the surface on the work that he does and his credentials. I have had the opportunity to work with Dr. Links on a number of small occasions and looking forward to working with him much more as we think about the growth of our center and the work that we're doing. He is really here to help us think about what an application looks like in real life and how you can really pair cutting edge research and the utility of having a research university in your city with the actual biggest, hardest challenges that your cities are facing. And he has done that with eloquence here in the city of Baltimore. Following last April's unrest resulting from the death of Freddie Gray, a team led by Dr. Links studied and released a series of recommendations to improve the city's preparedness and capacity to manage mass demonstrations and mitigate the risk of escalation, but thought about the problem in a holistic way as it relates to many of the factors that contributed to the unrest and to the rippling effects that unrest has had in our city. Dr. Links continues to work hand in hand with the Baltimore City Police Department to support implementation of these recommendations. So not just coming in and assessing a problem and identifying the gaps, but really putting the effort in to help advance the practice in the city itself. It's an excellent example of what we hope to achieve through our symposium, the relationships that we're building here as part of the 21st Century City Initiative with the Center for Government Excellence and JHU and everyone here in our cities and doing good work in our communities. Putting research into practice and helping to improve the lives of people that are living in our cities. So thank you, Dr. Links, for your work here in Baltimore, and also thank you for joining us today, closing us out.
Thank you. When I was asked to present, I leapt at the opportunity. I want to focus for a moment on the title here, because it's not my title. This title was chosen for me. Had I chosen a title, I couldn't have thought of a better title than this one. So a call to action is what we're really here for. And I really like the subtitle here, Taking a Systems Approach to Solving Problems in Our Cities. And I want to spend a couple of minutes just talking to you about what we mean here at Hopkins by a systems approach and how we think about problems in cities. So first, to me, when I think about this day and a half, participants in the symposium are hearing from faculty and from city leaders, and it's all about the ideas. But I want to emphasize that it's also about the process. And if all we leave here with is ideas, we won't get to where we need to go. We got to think about the process as much as we think about the ideas behind the process or the ideas we're chasing after by a process. I want to hit on many of the points that Phil just made and amplify in a number of ways. So one of the key points Phil made in his connect the dots slide was thinking about different scales. And a classic, in public health, a classic socio-ecologic model looks something like this, where you start in the middle with the individual and you expand out to sort of family and friends, organizations, the community, sort of the larger geographic scale around that. And I think a fundamental point is that whatever level of geographic scale you're working at, you cannot solve the problems at that scale by only focusing on that scale. So as you consider a problem at any scale, you have to consider all of the other scales that have bearing on that particular problem at the scale you're interested in. And so from a local jurisdictional perspective, we have to branch out in both directions. We have to grow to a larger scale and consider the region and the country, and we have to go to a smaller scale and consider neighborhoods, families, and individuals. I also think when we zero in on a problem, we have to resist the temptation to start by zeroing in on the problem. And for me personally, the concept that anchors virtually all of the conversations around challenges that cities face is the concept of well-being. And it was decades ago that the World Health Organization, in defining what it meant by the word health, proposed that it's a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And for me, this is a pretty expansive view of well-being, and you can argue that it's a nice definition at the individual level, at the family level, at the neighborhood level, at the jurisdictional level, and so on. And so I propose that we frame many of our conversations about specific challenges that cities face in this more expansive view of well-being, and it becomes a unifying theme across many of the specific challenges we're talking about. Now, having said that, important aspects of well-being and influential factors are likely going to vary jurisdiction by jurisdiction. So within this expansive framing of well-being, the challenges you're going to identify to work on in a given jurisdiction will change from one jurisdiction to another. But I think by having a common framing across jurisdictions, we build a network of solutions that can then transfer from one jurisdiction to another. So, what are the necessary ingredients? If we have a call to action, what do we need as we start assembling the ingredients for the recipe? The first is inspiration for action, and I think that inspiration, of course, comes from the jurisdictions, from the communities themselves. But honestly, I mean, when I listen to Phil, I mean, he's as inspired as anyone, right? And so the inspiration comes from academia as well. And within a jurisdiction, and when I say jurisdiction, I don't only mean local government, of course. I mean NGOs, CBOs, foundations, and I mean the community itself. Now, once you have that inspiration for action, it's really important to think about evidence-based interventions. And I'd just like to take a moment to push science. And I think a lot of times science is actually viewed as a luxury rather than a necessity as you're trying to address challenges in cities. We don't have the time for science. It's a nicety, it's a luxury. And without evidence-based interventions, you don't know if what you think you ought to be doing makes any sense at all. Because there's tons of stuff that seems very intuitive and very plausible as the right thing to do that actually turns out to be an utter and complete waste. And so we really do need to be able to embrace evidence-based interventions. And if there aren't evidence-based interventions, and sadly, for many of the challenges we're facing, there's inadequate evidence, if any evidence, to drive our decision-making around interventions, we have to then construct the interventions in a way that builds the evidence base. So we need to simultaneously be solving problems and doing science. They're not sequential, they're simultaneous, they work hand in hand. And the way to think about it is to take the fundamental principles and practices of risk assessment and risk management. Because, you know, some of the chief risk officer at Hopkins, I think the whole world is risk assessment and risk management. But it really is. You're either understanding the risks or you're doing something about them. And if you embrace the fundamental challenges in that way, you'll have the process working on your behalf. And so we need, in my opinion, strong academic and jurisdiction partnering. Remember, I have an expansive definition of jurisdiction. It's identification of the right players, it's continued engagement, and it's something that Phil hit on, building of trust. So I think about my own personal work with Baltimore City, which I'm very privileged to be able to do. And when I first started working with the city, I'm actually a radiation physicist by training. That'll explain a lot. And the fact of the matter is that when I started working with the city, it was in a very narrow context, which was radiation terrorism preparedness. And the folks in the city were convinced that they weren't going to understand a word that came out of my mouth. And if they asked me a question for which they needed a simple yes or no answer, that I would be incapable of giving it. And it was really only by continued engagement, a ton of work together, that they grew to trust me, I grew to understand how to most effectively interact with them, and so on. And so this notion of partnering, I think, is actually central to this entire enterprise. And it means identifying the right folks to work together and then creating an environment in which they can, on a very ongoing, very deep and meaningful way, actually work together. And then the final ingredient for me, and why I like the subtitle of this section of the symposium so much, is systems thinking. And by systems thinking, what we really mean is the process of understanding how things influence one another within a whole. So a system is a group of interacting, interrelated, and interdependent components that form a complex and unified whole. And systems thinking had its foundation in systems dynamics way back in the 50s. So I'm going to show you an example of a system. This is CDC-funded work of ours trying to understand what drives community resilience in disasters. And I'm not going to go through the details of this model, but I just want to give you a little taste of what we mean by systems thinking. So in the middle of this figure is a big reservoir of blue liquid, and that is community functioning. To the left of it are some of the domains of community functioning that drive our model. They're the goods and services that a community provides for its inhabitants. And all of the other boxes that have levels of liquid in them and valves that control the flow of liquid from one reservoir to another represent how the system interacts as a whole to give you the level of community functioning you have before there's a disaster and then during and after the disaster. And out of this model, which is backed up by a series of linked differential equations, you get a predicted time course of community functioning before, during, and after a disaster. There is no way in the world you can intuit that time course. You need to construct a system that has all of the factors that influence the time course of community functioning, and you need to construct the interactions between them. If you never write a line of math or computer code, just having a diagram like this is a more systematic way to think about the factors that influence any given challenge. In our case, we do have a bunch of math and computer code behind the model, and we're able to produce county-level, countrywide maps of things like community functioning before a disaster, and then predicted resilience after a disaster in a number of ways. We're also able to operate at different geographic scales. So we're doing a lot of work with New York City in the context of post-Sandy. What can we learn from Sandy to drive community resilience moving forward? And so in New York City, we can operate at a much finer geographic scale in terms of the data that are available to us, and of course, in terms of the interventions that are available to us as well. Now, as Beth mentioned, we were fortunate enough to be asked by the city to analyze its response to last year's unrest. And here's a report. It's publicly available. We examined the response in 5 different areas: strategy, policy, and tactics, incident command, information and communications, preparedness, resource management, equipment and training, and health, safety, and morale. The reason I'm telling you about this effort is it had nothing to do with math, computers, systems models, etc. So it is true that systems thinking and a systematic approach is, in my opinion, the right way to tackle these challenges. But it doesn't mean it has to be about data, it has to be about math, and it has to be about computers crunching numbers. It's simply, how do you think holistically about any given problem? And so this example relates to the fancy computer example I just gave, in that it takes a whole of community view. It includes the leveraging of daily routine approaches, for example, community policing. This was another of Phil's points that I want to amplify. So one of the most fundamental things we found was that the city had no policy, and I don't mean a written document, I mean they didn't have a philosophical statement or point of view about how to handle mass demonstrations. And the evidence shows that the prevailing best approach is negotiated management, meaning a negotiation between the city and the demonstrators. Negotiated management rests on a pre-existing foundation of community engagement, community policing, and good community law enforcement relations. You cannot separate out what you need to do in this particular example, in a mass demonstration, from what you're doing every single day in that jurisdiction. And so the interrelation of an acute challenge with a chronic challenge this is just one of millions of examples I could give. And then it also relies, of course, on this partnering that we think is so important. So, moving forward, this is sort of my final plea, if you will. I looked at the Symposium's website, and I liked a lot of the language on the website. And I just want to highlight some of it. And this was sort of how the Symposium ahead of time was characterized. And one key thing was innovative approaches to solve urban challenges that are grounded in research and data. That's evidence-based interventions. Bring together a diverse group of leaders committed to strengthening American cities. And that's about partnering. It's about academic jurisdictional partnering. And then the third point, which is the point Beth made with her stay in touch slide, is we're here to help. And the way we're here to help is you can directly engage us. We want you. We're desperate to have you directly engage us. We will work with you, and we will help you identify local subject matter experts who can also work with you. We'll help you to identify one or two key challenges, because as much as we take this very top-down, systems-oriented approach, you've got to be able to make progress on a meaningful time scale. And that means doing things top-down and bottom-up simultaneously. And then we'll do so holistically with a systems approach, while at the same time working one or two specific challenges, so you're seeing real progress and you're feeling a sense of efficacy in terms of addressing the challenges of a 21st century city. Thank you.
So that is our day and our symposium. I want to thank everyone again for being here. I want to remind everyone, the team was in the discussion rooms, and we've been taking sort of very comprehensive notes, and we'll be sending out the content to sort of continue the conversation. But also, if you missed anything, if you didn't get to go to the third breakout session, then we'll be able to provide that back to you. Thank you all for being here, for spending your last day and a half with us. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and I look very much forward to what happens over the next several months as a follow-up to this symposium, and as we head into thinking about what this looks like the next time that we do it, which would hopefully be soon. So thank you. Anything else I'm missing? Okay. All right. Well, thanks a lot. Have a great one.